On October 7, 1861, Thomas Jonathan Jackson, now famous throughout the entire Confederacy and even abroad in Europe for his role in the Battle of Manassas, which has earned him the immortal nickname of Stonewall, is promoted to the rank of Major General and appointed to the command of the newly formed Valley District of the Confederate Army, with its headquarters in Winchester, Virginia. Stonewall Jackson's mission is made clear from the start by his superiors: prevent any federal army from advancing through the Shenandoah Valley to attack Richmond, and protect the valley from Union occupation. The Shenandoah Valley is nicknamed the breadbasket of the Confederacy for being a major granary for the South and providing a majority of the foodstuffs for the Confederate cause. As such, it is strategically important to the Confederacy's war effort. Besides being a valuable southern breadbasket, the Shenandoah Valley is also a key overland route for rebel armies to outflank Washington to the north, or for Union forces to drive deep into the Confederacy to the south. The valley stretches in a northeastern direction, starting from southern Virginia in the city of Roanoke all the way up towards Winchester in the north. Its shape is like a knife pointed directly towards the north, as some put it. Both sides quickly recognize its significance. Indeed, Winchester, as the northernmost gate to the valley and the hub of 9 major wagon roads in the Winchester and Potomac Railroad, is so important that it will change hands 72 times throughout the course of the war. To keep the valley out of Union hands, Jackson is ordered there in November of 1861. Under his command at his first valley headquarters in Winchester are 2,000 mostly inexperienced troops. His gunners are so green they don't even know how to load their only 2 cannon. By the end of the year, however, he has 10,000 men of varying degrees of quality, including his old command at Manassas, the 1st Virginia Brigade, now, like its former commander, rebranded as the Stonewall Brigade. By March of 1862, Jackson's army has dwindled again to less than 5,000 men due to a bitterly cold winter campaign waged in northern Virginia and parts of what would become West Virginia along the western edge of the Shenandoah Valley. This campaign, waged by Stonewall Jackson in the snowy days of January 1st through 24th, 1862, is known as the Romney Expedition, named so for its ultimate objective of Romney, Virginia, now in West Virginia. Although Jackson had suffered few battle losses during the campaign, William Loring, in command of the division left behind to garrison several towns recaptured from the Federals, successfully petitioned the War Department for the troops to be withdrawn and reassigned, depriving Stonewall of most of his men. Union commanders are not idle during this time either, but their attention is focused further to the east, on the Maryland side of the Potomac River. From there, Union forces could either defend Washington, or if the Confederates remain quiet, launch an invasion of their own into the valley. Over the winter, 3 divisions are quietly assembled along the Potomac. With their support personnel, they number 38,000 men. This force was originally the 5th Corps of the Army of the Potomac in the late summer of 1861, but by now its detached status has redesignated the command as the Department of the Shenandoah. This newly raised field army is led by Major General Nathaniel P. Banks. At this time, Nathaniel Prentice Banks is, by seniority, the 4th highest ranking military officer in the Union Army. He is a well-connected political general from Massachusetts. From 1858 to 1861, Banks has served as the 24th governor of the state of Massachusetts. Before that, from 1857 to 1858, Banks has served in Congress as the 21st Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, and has served Massachusetts with prominence as a member of the House since 1853. He was criticized by many of his contemporaries as a political chameleon, having already switched through 2 other political parties until finally back in the Republicans before the outbreak of the Civil War. On June 11, 1861, Banks was appointed to the command of the Department of Annapolis in eastern Maryland, which would become in July of that year the Department of Maryland, and soon afterwards merged into the military district of the Potomac. By the end of February 1862, Major General Banks has crossed some of his forces into Virginia at Harper's Ferry. Major General Jackson has, by now, been back in Winchester for about a month. After hearing of Banks' move to Harper's Ferry, he realizes his force of 4,200 men is no match for the Federals. They pull out of Winchester on March 11th. It is none too soon. Banks, although slowed by the problem of getting his heavy equipment across the Potomac, arrives in Winchester the very next day, March 12th. With the Confederates in retreat, Banks feels comfortable in sending some of his command to aid Major General George B. McClellan in his upcoming Peninsula campaign. On March 14th, Brigadier General John Sedgwick's division starts marching east. Then, on March 17th, Banks sends Brigadier General James Shields' 1st Division after Jackson, who has retreated 18 miles to Strasburg. James Shields, like his commanding officer, is a political appointee to military office. Unlike Banks, however, Shields is also an aggressive soldier. In 1842, he had challenged an out-of-office politician to a duel over an alleged libel. Fortunately, the duel never took place. The politician's name was Abraham Lincoln. By the time the war broke out, the men had settled their differences and become friends. In addition, Shields has some practical military experience, having served as a brigade commander during the Mexican War. Shields wastes no time marching his men to Strasburg, then another 5 miles southwest of Woodstock the next day. Jackson, though, is not in the neighborhood. Stonewall has brought his command to Mount Jackson, some 37 miles southwest of Woodstock. Between Jackson and Shields are Colonel Turner Ashby's troopers of the 7th Virginia Cavalry Regiment, acting as a very effective screen for the tiny main force. A few of Shields' own cavalrymen actually reach the Mount Jackson area, but are prevented by Ashby's men from learning anything about Jackson's deployment. Over March 19th and 20th, Shields brings his entire 1st Division back to Winchester. There, the first of a number of faulty intelligence reports that will eventually lead to the Battle of Kernstown are delivered. In it, Shields affirms to Banks that only a small Confederate cavalry contingent remains in the Shenandoah Valley. Banks couldn't have been happier. His assignment has proven far easier than expected. He orders a 2nd Division under Brigadier General Alpheus S. Williams to leave for McClellan's command the next day. Banks himself returns to Washington on March 22nd. This leaves only Shields' 7,000-man 1st Division in the valley. In addition to this force, he has 750 cavalry and 900 artillerymen with 24 guns. Offhand, this appears to be plenty. With the Union confidently pulling out of the Shenandoah Valley, having barely raised a sweat, the stage now belongs to Colonel Turner Ashby, the extravagant cavalier who has earned the nickname of the Black Knight of the Confederacy for his handsome looks and mannerisms, Southern chivalry, and his cavalry command. He and his troopers have done a magnificent job screening Jackson from Union horsemen and have followed Shields back down the valley to Winchester. On the evening of March 21st, Ashby sends word to Stonewall Jackson that large numbers of enemy soldiers are leaving for the east. Jackson, just as incensed as Banks is elated, has as much vaunted foot cavalry as his men become known for their long distances covered in forced marches during the campaign, marching back northeast by dawn. Besides defending the valley, his orders are also to tie down excess Union troops that could be used to threaten Richmond. So far, it appears he has failed. This galls him. Except for Jackson's movement, most of March 22nd is quiet. Late in the day, however, Colonel Ashby becomes antsy and restless. Around 4 p.m., he moves up his artillery, chews Virginia Battery along with the Ashby Horse Artillery, and begins shelling Union skirmishers posted on the southern outskirts of Winchester. At first, Ashby is successful, forcing the Union troops back towards the town. However, Shields reacts immediately and brings up reinforcements, leading them himself. Skirmishing is heavy, but eventually Colonel Ashby is forced back. The shooting dies out around sunset, with the Union troops halting about halfway between Winchester and Kernstown. Shields, however, is out of the fight. He has suffered a broken arm from a shell fragment. As he is leaving the battle, Shields orders Colonel Nathan Kimball, commander of the 1st Brigade, to take command of the division. Kimball, also a veteran in the Mexican War, thus becomes the 3rd commanding officer to lead the division in just 3 weeks. The original commander, Brigadier General Frederick Lander, has died of illness on March 2nd. Shields himself had taken command only 2 weeks earlier. Overnight, Shields sends Kimball orders to clear Ashby's observation force from the area. The wounded commander also sends a brigade north to confuse the enemy, but keeps it within marching distance of Winchester. In the meantime, Ashby delivers another report to Jackson. Based on his observations, some intelligence from misinformed Confederate sympathizers, the cavalry officer tells Stonewall that the Union forces before them number only 3,000 men in 4 regiments, a small cavalry contingent, and 1 battery of artillery, and even these are scheduled to return to Harper's Ferry on the 23rd. Shields' ruse has worked all too well. On March 23, 1862, the fighting resumes early, marking the opening actions of the Battle of Kernstown. Colonel Kimball's 1st Brigade continues to push back Ashby's cavalry, although it has become reinforced with 4 companies of early arriving infantry. At this point, the key event of the day occurs. The pressure on Ashby is enormous, and he continues to retreat all the way to the other side of Kernstown. In doing so, he abandons the single most important piece of terrain in the area, a small knoll called Pritchard's Hill just north of the village, which happens to be the only high ground in the area and is also centrally located. Realizing the hill's importance, Kimball stations his entire 1st Brigade plus 2 batteries of artillery, Battery A, West Virginia Light Artillery, and Battery H, 1st Ohio Light Artillery, in a strong defensive position. From there, he has full command of the battlefield below. Kimball, probably in an effort to paint himself as an energetic, bold leader, later puts the completion time of these movements as early as 8 a.m. Other sources set the action between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. In any event, what cannot be disputed is that Kimball spends several hours awaiting developments and ignoring orders streaming from Shields back in Winchester. In this, he is correct. Shields' information about ongoing events is inevitably out of date by the time Shields' orders in turn reach Kimball. In the meantime, Kimball completes his preparations, moving Colonel Jeremiah C. Sullivan's 2nd Brigade and Battery L, 1st Ohio Light Artillery, to his left flank, even with the southern edge of Pritchard's Hill, and holding Colonel Erastus B. Tyler's 3rd Brigade as a reserve out of sight behind the hill. His right flank is left open. Kimball then, according to his report, determined to remain on the defensive. About mid-afternoon, Jackson arrives at Kernstown. After conferring with Ashby, he is content that the majority of the small Union force is entrenched on Pritchard's Hill, directly in front of him. Unfortunately, he breaks up one of his own rules and fails to reconnoiter the situation for himself, opting to accept Ashby's report at face value. To his right, Jackson knows is another contingent of enemy troops. Although it appears obvious to him that this force cannot be very large, the terrain is forbidding. The Union soldiers are deployed along Hog Run, which runs east to west. In addition, Confederate troops will have to cross large areas of open territory before reaching the run, exposing them to fire from Pritchard's Hill. An assault up the hill directly in front of him is enticing because the important Valley Turnpike runs along the eastern foot, but Jackson quickly realizes that such an attack by his dog-tired men would be futile. Still, the left flank holds much promise. It is free of enemy troops, and its commanding feature, Sandy Ridge, is covered by dense forest that would provide cover from the guns on the hill. In addition, Hog Run breaks into 2 forks between Kernstown and Pritchard's Hill, neither of which is much more than a stream. The northern fork snakes back towards the hill where Jackson doesn't want to go anyway, while the southern fork is both short and shallow. The troops who couldn't march around it could easily ford it. The woods to the west then would be where Jackson would try to outflank the Yankees. Jackson gives the order to deploy. A few of Ashby's men are sent to skirmish along Hog Run and hold the flank while the rest of the cavalry and his 3 brigades will left and march for the woods. Almost from the start, however, things begin to unravel. Jackson's lead brigade, the 3rd Brigade under Colonel Samuel Fulkerson, marches off smartly under the covering fire of rebel cannon in the vicinity of Kernstown. The return fire, however, is deadly and far more hardy than anticipated. The Southerners run for safety of the ridge. Jackson, chastened, reacts with something close to panic. He orders 1 regiment of the Stonewall Brigade to move forward to support Fulkerson. The brigade's commander, Brigadier General Richard B. Garnett, later to become a key figure in the battle, hurries off to get the 33rd Virginia underway. While he is away, a second command arrives from Jackson, ordering him to move up the entire brigade. Unfortunately, Garnett isn't around to receive it. Jackson sees only a quarter of Garnett's men moving and grows furious. He personally takes command of the stationary units and orders them forward. Garnett now gets news of Jackson's second set of orders and, totally confused, halts the 33rd Virginia in place while he goes off to get clarification. Meanwhile, 2 of the 3 regiments Jackson is commanding wander off. Their officers unsure if they should be following Garnett's or Jackson's orders. Colonel Kimball, in the meantime, is enjoying an eagle's eye view of the Confederate confusion. Although he certainly must be enjoying the spectacle, especially since some of it is occurring within range of his guns, he's also shrewd enough to realize that his right flank is being threatened. He orders his hidden reserve brigade to counter the enemy movements. Eventually, Jackson gets his command somewhat straightened out. Fulkerson's 2 tiny regiments, only 400 men, have plodded on and find themselves emerging from the woods. Halfway across a clearing runs a stone wall half a mile long. At the same time, Kimball's reserve brigade emerges from the other side of the clearing. The Confederates win the race for the wall. The situation stabilizes. The Union attempts 2 assaults on the wall, but both are repulsed. Garnett brings up most of the Stonewall brigade, taking up position along the wall to Fulkerson's right. Kimball moves his own infantry off Pritchard's Hill and attacks Garnett. The fighting now becomes furious as the Stonewall changes hand twice over the next 2 hours. Meanwhile, Jackson has become painfully aware of the trap. A subordinate has found a high clearing which he can see Kimball's men coming off Pritchard's Hill. His report is far more accurate than Ashby's. He sees 9,000 to 10,000 Federals in the area. "Say no more of it," Jackson replies. "We are in for it." The impasse at the Stonewall continues until about 6 p.m. Union troops come on in wave after wave while the Confederates resolutely counterattack and then defend their ground, until finally the Stonewall Brigade runs out of ammunition. In addition, Union cavalry are beginning to demonstrate around the southern left flank. The crisis is reached. Garnett later says that if he had only been able to confer with Jackson, Stonewall would have concurred with his subsequent decision to withdraw. Jackson, however, is in the rear, bringing up a reserve regiment in an attempt to break the stalemate. Garnett holds off as long as he thinks possible, but feels compelled to eventually sound the retreat. Unfortunately, the retreat soon becomes a rout. Suddenly, Jackson finds himself swimming in a ragged sea of frightened soldiers now headed in the opposite direction. Moving on, he finds Garnett, but between the 2 of them, they are unable to rally the troops. Jackson's antiquated admonition to give them the bayonet holds no sway with soldiers who are out of bullets. In short order, Fulkerson's men too are forced to retire. Their right flank is exposed. They too run off in panic. Fortunately, the 2 brigades that had bore the brunt of the Union fighting are too disorganized for an effective pursuit. Jackson, ever an optimist, hopes that the 5th Virginia Infantry Regiment might still win the day. But Garnett makes a decision that later leads to his court-martial by Jackson. Instead of ordering the 5th Virginia forward to attack as Jackson wishes, Garnett has it deploy in a defensive position to cover the retreat. It is gratifyingly effective in this role, garnering enough time to allow Jackson to move his last brigade into the area in support. That night, Jackson pitches his camp 4.5 miles back down the Valley Turnpike at Newtown. The Battle of Kernstown is over, ending in one of Stonewall Jackson's only defeats of his Civil War career. Beginning that night and continuing to the end of his life, Shields brags that he is the only Union general to defeat Jackson in an open battle. While technically correct, the honor, if not the rank, more accurately belongs to Kimball. On the day Shields resumes command after recovering from his injuries, April 30th, Kimball is promoted to brigadier general for his victory over Stonewall Jackson. The hapless Garnett, however, has incurred Jackson's wrath. Although widely regarded as Jackson's best general, Garnett is arrested immediately after the battle for his unauthorized retreat. The affair actually gets as far as a court-martial in August, but after only 2 officers testify, one of them Jackson, the war intervenes and nothing more comes of it. Garnett remains an admirer of Jackson and is even an honorary pallbearer at Stonewall's funeral, despite his well-publicized difficulties with him. Kernstown is not the first run-in between the two, only the most serious. It is fair to say that, at least, Garnett's admiration of Jackson is not mutual. Garnett returns to command, but he will be killed at Gettysburg a year later while he is leading a brigade on horseback in the famed Pickett's Charge. The Battle of Kernstown is, all things considered, a minor engagement. According to Jackson, he has 3,087 infantry and 27 cannon under him. Ashby's cavalry numbers only 290, which Jackson generously attributes to heavy cavalry duty and the extent of the country to be protected in his official report. However, a month later, Jackson relieves Ashby of command for his lack of discipline. Among the charges is that Ashby allowed the other half of his troops to wander about the Kernstown area on their own because Ashby did not believe they would be needed until the next day. Ashby gets his command back 3 days later after a vigorous protest. The total Confederate losses over the 2 days numbered just 80 dead, 375 wounded, and 263 captured or missing. On the other side, Shields reports his losses at 118 killed, 450 wounded, and 22 captured or missing. Yet, despite these small numbers, Kernstown is one of the most decisive strategic engagements of the war. The Confederates, although soundly defeated, ultimately gained the most. The victory itself is insignificant, but the fact that it is fought at all is a great deal to both sides. Indeed, the ramifications of this odd little affair reach all the way to the desk of President Lincoln. None of the Union generals with an interest in the Shenandoah Valley, Shields, Banks, or McClellan, could believe that Jackson would attack while being so outnumbered. They never realized that Jackson thinks he outnumbers them. In their eyes, Jackson must be a far greater threat than in fact he actually is. Banks is ordered to return immediately to the Shenandoah Valley with Williams' 9,000-man division. Lincoln, who suffers from an almost pathological fear of a Confederate attack upon the federal capital, withdraws a 40,000-man corps from McClellan's command, Major General Irvin McDowell's First Corps. These troops would protect Washington from the Fredericksburg area. Meanwhile, McClellan's Peninsula campaign would just have to do without them. In addition, Lincoln takes a further 10,000-man division and sends it to join 5,000 other Union troops guarding against Jackson in Western Virginia, not yet a federal state at this time. At the very least, Jackson's 3,600 men have tied up almost 65,000 Union troops at a time when a decisive campaign to end the war quickly is being undertaken. Later, 10,000 men from Fredericksburg reinforced McClellan, but so great is Lincoln's fear that he never allows the remaining 30,000 men to march south and support McClellan with an attack on Richmond's north side. Stonewall Jackson may have suffered a defeat at Kernstown, but he has only lost the first round of the campaign. He is not out of the fight entirely. Over the next month and a half, Jackson will regroup his depleted Valley District, receive more reinforcements in the form of Major General Richard S. Ewell's division, and prepare to strike back against the Union Army. Jackson's Valley campaign is only just getting started. Following the Battle of Kernstown on March 23, 1862, Confederate Major General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson retreats with his Valley District to Mount Jackson, further down the Shenandoah Valley. Union Major General Nathaniel P. Banks, with his Department of the Shenandoah reinforced significantly, pursues Jackson deeper into the valley, determined to destroy his forces in another pitched battle. By mid-April, with mounting pressure from Banks' approaching army, Jackson continues his withdrawal through the Middle Valley region. He soon establishes his camps at Swift Run Gap in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Meanwhile, Banks moves south to Harrisonburg, where he will remain until early May. Stonewall Jackson's challenge now is to hold the entire Shenandoah Valley for the Confederacy. He must carry out his given task to prevent Union Army forces then stationed in the Valley and in Western Virginia, from moving east to support Major General George B. McClellan's campaign against Richmond. Of the immediate concern to Jackson is the possibility that Banks will link up with troops in the newly created Mountain Department, commanded by Major General John C. Fremont. The vanguard of Fremont's command, Brigadier General Robert H. Milroy's brigade, is already pushing east towards Stanton, an important rail and supply center for the Confederacy. On April 29th, Jackson telegraphs General Robert E. Lee, military advisor to Confederate President Jefferson Davis in Richmond, laying out 3 different plans for dealing with the Union threat. Unite with Brigadier General Edward Allegheny Johnson's command, known as the Army of the Northwest, located west of Stanton, and strike Milroy. Join forces with Major General Richard Stoddard Ewell's division, over 8,000 strong and already moving towards the valley from the Rappahannock River around Culpeper to reinforce Jackson, and head north in the valley, taking on Banks' Federals, or link up with Ewell and move up the eastern side of the Blue Ridge Mountains, threatening General Banks' line of communication. General Lee allows the final decision to fall upon Jackson as to which plan to adopt, and Jackson chooses the first: unite with Allegheny Johnson and move against Milroy. The next day, April 30th, as Ewell's division is approaching Swift Run Gap, Jackson leads his command south, then east across the Blue Ridge to Meckham Station, a stop on the Virginia Central Railroad and not too far from Charlottesville, Virginia. To Major General Banks, this shows that Jackson is leaving the Shenandoah Valley, and the Union General reports it as such to Washington, D.C. But Jackson's move is a clever ruse. Once at Meckham's, the bulk of Jackson's force boards railroad cars and returns to Stanton in the valley. Part of Jackson's command has to march, but by May 5th, Jackson has all his troops in Stanton. Believing Major General Jackson to be gone from the Shenandoah Valley, the authorities in Washington orders Banks to withdraw down the valley to Strasburg and to send the division commanded by Brigadier General James Shields back east. On May 7th, Jackson, now numbering some 11,600 after joining forces with Johnson, starts moving west on the Stanton-Parkersburg Turnpike. As Jackson's columns marches, there is some skirmishing with Milroy's outpost, but in the late morning of May 8th, Jackson reaches the outskirts of McDowell. Around noon, Jackson, Johnson, Jedediah Hotchkiss, Jackson's cartographer, who has surveyed much of the valley and provided Stonewall with an excellently drawn maps of the region, and a small number of Confederate infantry, scale Sitlinton's Hill, an elevation that rises nearly 600 feet above the level plain below and dominates the immediate area. While reconnoitering Milroy's camps in and around McDowell a mile distant, Stonewall Jackson determines that he will attack the Federals the next day, but Milroy beats him to the punch. Milroy convinces Brigadier General Robert Schenck, whose brigade arrives at mid-morning. With Schenck's men, Milroy could count perhaps 4,500 troops, that the best defense is a spoiling attack. Attack the Confederates, catching them off guard, then retreat after dark. Milroy is also concerned with reports that Confederate artillery is being positioned on Sitlinton's Hill. From there, enemy cannon could easily hit the Federal camps in McDowell. At 4:30 p.m. on May 8, 1862, the Battle of McDowell, also known as the Battle of Sitlinton's Hill, begins when 5 Union regiments, some 2,500 infantry supported by artillery, move out from McDowell to attack the Confederates posted on Sitlinton's Hill. They cross the Bull Pasture River and begin marching up Sitlinton's Hill in brigade line of battle. The job is not an easy one to carry out. Colonel Nathaniel C. McLean, commander of the 75th Ohio and in charge of the Federal attack, remembered that the side of the mountain up which I was compelled to attack was entirely destitute of protection, either from trees or rocks, and so steep that the men were at times compelled to march either to one side or the other in order to make the assault. For many Union and Confederate soldiers at McDowell, this is their first introduction to battle, and probably would have echoed Colonel George H. Smith of the 25th Virginia Infantry. who writes afterwards that this was my first fight and I hardly knew what to do. Despite the lack of experience, the Battle of McDowell sees intense combat, starting before 6 p.m. and lasting well after dark. One participant recalled that the sheets of flame shot from the angry mouths of the guns, lighting up the whole side. Although the Confederates are defending, they actually suffer higher casualties. This is primarily due to several factors. For one, the sun sets in the west, behind the Union lines, and so the Confederates are silhouetted against the clear sky to the east. Next, because Confederates stand above their Union foe, they tend to overshoot. And finally, most of the Federal infantry are armed with rifled muskets, while many Confederates are still armed with smoothbores. One Confederate regiment, the 12th Georgia Infantry, takes especially high casualties. During the action on Sitlington's Hill, the 12th Georgia takes position on the left center of the Confederate line on top of the hill. There they occupy a ridge spur that requires the regiment to form like an inverted V. This position, exposed to the enemy from three sides, is one reason the Georgians suffer high such casualties. But there are other reasons. The 12th Georgia's ranks are using 69 caliber smoothbore guns, mainly outdated Mexican War era Springfield model 1842 muskets, whose effective range is little more than 100 yards, about as far away as the Federals stand, while their opponents, the 75th Ohio, are using rifled muskets such as the newly developed Springfield model 1861, with much greater range and accuracy using ammunition in the form of the Manet balls. Also, as evening falls over the battlefield, the Georgians find themselves silhouetted against a clear sky to the east, making them find targets. Finally, as losses mount, the 12th Georgia's officers order their men to pull back to a less exposed position. The men refuse, and the next day, one member of the regiment explains that, "We did not come all the way to Virginia to run before the Yankees." Their bravery cost them dearly. Entering the battle with 540 in the ranks, the 12th Georgia sees 52 killed, 123 wounded, a loss of nearly 35%. Action along the Stanton-Parkersburg Turnpike also sees the Union 3rd West Virginia face skirmishers from the 31st Virginia. Some members from both regiments have been recruited in Clarksburg, where Stonewall Jackson was born, so while exchanging volleys, they also call out their former neighbors by name. The fighting continues after dark, but close to 9 p.m., as Union soldiers begin to run low on ammunition, General Milroy orders his men to withdraw. They pull back into McDowell, bringing as many of their wounded with them as they can. And before 2 a.m. on May 9th, the Federals begin a retreat to Franklin, Virginia. Jackson moves into the village of McDowell the next morning, assigning to the Virginia Military Institute cadets, who were present at the battle but had not taken part in the fighting, the unpleasant task of burying the dead and dealing with the wounded. Union casualties at McDowell numbered 256, while the Confederates suffer 532. Of that number, the 12th Georgia Infantry alone loses 175 men. On the next morning of May 9th, Jackson sends news to Richmond, writing, "God bless our arms with victory at McDowell yesterday. This victory is received with great jubilation, for the Confederacy has experienced numerous setbacks that spring. A Union blockade that is starting to take effect, the loss of Island Number 10 in New Orleans along the Mississippi River, the defeat of Shiloh, and McClellan's Army of the Potomac itching its way up towards Richmond. Jackson's victory at McDowell does much to raise Southern morale. It also stops the Federal advance into the upper Shenandoah Valley and to Stanton." The next day, May 10th, Jackson begins his pursuit of the Union forces, following them to Franklin. Satisfied that they had been dealt with for the time being, Jackson turns back to McDowell and then to Stanton. Now, Jackson can turn his attention to Major General Banks, and that is exactly what he would do. Following his victory at the Battle of McDowell or Sitlington's Hill on May 8, 1862, Major General Stonewall Jackson, with his Valley District, pursues his defeated Union foe, Brigadier General Robert H. Milroy, towards Franklin, Virginia. He then retraces his steps back to McDowell and finally to Stanton in the Shenandoah Valley. By this time, Major General Richard S. Ewell's division, over 8,000 strong, has been biding its time at Swift Run Gap in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and Union Major General Nathaniel P. Banks' Department of the Shenandoah, having left Harrisonburg on May 9th, has started its withdrawal down the valley, reaching Strasburg on May 13th. On May 18th, General Ewell meets with Jackson at Mount Solon, which is southwest of Harrisonburg, to discuss plans for dealing with Banks' Federals. The first problem they face is Ewell's orders from their superior, General Joseph E. Johnston, directing Ewell to leave the valley and bring his division to Richmond. After some back and forth communication, however, and with some help from military advisor General Robert E. Lee, Major General Ewell is allowed to stay with Jackson, with Johnston's orders now reading, in part, "The objective you have to accomplish is the prevention of the junction of General Banks' troops with those of General McDowell. Major General Irvin McDowell is waiting in Fredericksburg with perhaps 30,000 troops in his First Corps, and he is scheduled to march south in support of Union Major General George B. McClellan's campaign against Richmond on the Peninsula." Initially, Jackson and Ewell planned to unite at New Market. Together, their forces would number about 17,000, then march north on the Valley Turnpike, striking Banks at Strasburg. After reaching New Market on May 21st, however, Jackson learns that only a small Union garrison holds the town of Front Royal, about 15 miles east of Strasburg, so Jackson determines to cross Massanutten Mountain over the New Market Gap, link up with Ewell in Page County, and from there, march north and overwhelm the 1,100 or so Yankees at Front Royal. Leaving part of Colonel Turner Ashby's 7th Virginia Cavalry Regiment to press north on the Valley Turnpike, leading Banks to think the main thrust would come from that direction, Jackson leads his command over Massanutten Mountain. On May 22nd, he links up with Ewell, and together they push north. By striking at Front Royal, Jackson would be placing his forces between Banks and McDowell, thus accomplishing his objective. Meanwhile, Banks could count on no more than 8,000 men in his command, 6,100 infantry and cavalry with 16 artillery pieces at Strasburg, the 1,100-man garrison at Front Royal, and a small outpost at Buckton Station about midway between the two towns. On May 23rd, as Stonewall Jackson's force approaches Front Royal from the south, Confederate cavalry under Colonels Ashby and Thomas Flournoy, which has led the advance, swings west and crosses the South Fork of the Shenandoah River. Their mission is to cut the communication between Strasburg and Front Royal. Meanwhile, from Union pickets captured south of Front Royal, Jackson learns that most of the federal garrison there belongs to the 1st Maryland Volunteer Infantry. Knowing that, he calls on his own Confederate 1st Maryland Regiment, commanded by Colonel Bradley T. Johnson, to lead the attack. This is to be supported by part of Brigadier General Richard Taylor's Louisiana Brigade, which includes the famed Wheat's Tigers of the 1st Louisiana Special Battalion. This would be the only time in the Civil War, as well as U.S. military history, when regiments from the same state, with the same numerical designation, would face each other in battle. In order to avoid the Union picket posts on the main road south of Front Royal, Jackson chooses to march his men up a steep, winding path called Snake Road by the locals, about a mile south of the town. Soon after 1 p.m. on May 23, 1862, Colonel Johnson's Marylanders, no doubt exhausted after the climb, crest the last wooded hill that leads into Front Royal and drive out a nest of Federals who are quietly resting at the head of Snake Road. This marks the start of the Battle of Front Royal, sometimes referred to in accounts as the Battle of Guard's Hill. After a few minutes of skirmishing, the Confederates are met by a rather well-looking woman, the famous Southern spy Isabella Maria Boyd, often known by her nickname as Bella Boyd. She is a citizen of Front Royal who is drawn by the fire on the hill, and she extols the men to charge right down and you'll catch them all. Believing Boyd's story, Jackson orders Colonel Johnson, Major Chatham R. Wheat, and Brigadier General Taylor to do just that while he brings up the rest of his army. Front Royal is less than a mile to their front. Another half mile or so beyond the hamlet, up the main road and atop the position known as Richardson's Hill, is the main camp for Colonel John R. Kinley's Union 1st Maryland. Beyond that is a confluence of the north and south forks of the Shenandoah River. A bridge spans each fork, and a viaduct of the Manassas Gap Railroad crosses the South Fork and heads west to Strasburg, where Banks' headquarters is located. The federal garrison at Front Royal consists of 16 companies of infantry, 9 from the 1st Maryland, 3 from the 2nd Massachusetts, 2 from the 29th Pennsylvania, and 1 each from the 3rd Wisconsin and 27th Indiana. They are supported by 2 companies of the 5th New York Cavalry, a section of rifled 10-pounder Parrott guns from the Pennsylvania Light Artillery, and a company of engineers. All told, there are about 1,100 federal soldiers in and around the town. The gray uniformed Marylanders and Wheat's Tigers are ordered to drive down the hill and storm Front Royal, while General Taylor brings up the rest of his Louisiana brigade. Major Wheat, excited by the order and no doubt wanting to vindicate himself after being defeated at an earlier skirmish known as the Battle of Somerville, charges down the left side of the road and is the first Confederate to enter the town. Colonel Johnson later reported, "He shot by like a rocket," adding, "his red cap gleaming, revolver in hand, and got in first, throwing his shots right and left." Lucy Rebecca Buck, the daughter of a respected landowner in Front Royal, remembered the initial clash between Federal and Confederate forces at Front Royal. "Going to the door, we saw the Yankees scampering over the meadow below our house. By this time, some scattered parties of Confederate infantry came up and charged their ranks. After firing one volley, they wheeled about. Every man for himself, they scampered out of the town like a flock of sheep. Such an undignified exodus was never witnessed before." Once the Federals are driven from Front Royal, supported by Colonel Isaac G. Seymour, 6th Louisiana, ordered the men to head for the main Federal camp on Richardson's Hill, north of the town. As the emboldened Confederates approached a ridgeline that fronts Richardson's Hill, however, they are forced to the ground by 2 10-pounder Parrott rifles and several companies of infantry firing down from the fortified encampment. Major Wheat orders his Tigers to take cover around Rose Hill Manor, a large brick and wood structure about 250 yards to the right front of the Federal line, where, according to Lucy Buck, a good deal of fighting was done. Before long, Jackson himself arrives on the scene with Captain James Carrington's Charlottesville artillery and posted atop a hill to Wheat's right rear. With Wheat's Tigers and Johnson's Marylanders pinned down, General Taylor recommends a double envelopment. While Wheat's and Johnson's men continue to fix Kinley's position in front and Carrington's battery provides support, Taylor points out that he can sweep his 7th, 8th, and 9th Louisiana regiments to the far right, past Johnson's Marylanders, and cross the relatively unguarded railroad trestle that spans the South Fork, getting in Kinley's rear. As they do so, Colonel Seymour's 6th Louisiana Infantry Regiment would sweep to the left, making a dash for the South Fork Bridge immediately behind Kinley's camp and drawing the Federals' fire. Without hesitation, and no doubt impressed by the Louisianans' enterprise, Jackson nods in approval, and Taylor launches his first major attack of the war. From his hilltop bastion, Colonel Kinley watches helplessly as the Louisianans make their way around his position. He decides to order his men to torch the camp and retreat across both branches of the Shenandoah before they are completely cut off. Once across the north branch, Kinley orders the bridge burned and establishes a new line along the riverbank, anchored by the precipitous Guard Hill, to hold back the enemy as long as possible while he alerts Banks to the threat. On the heels of Kinley's retreating Federals, Colonel Johnson's Marylanders charge up Richardson's Hill and through the burning camp, snagging a few prisoners and crossing over the South Fork Bridge. Advancing another 400 yards up the road, they are stopped cold by Kinley's new line atop Guard Hill and by the burning North Fork Bridge. They are soon joined by Taylor and his Louisiana regiments, who are just now crossing the South Fork. With the low-lying North Fork Bridge on fire, overlooked by Federal artillery posted atop Guard Hill, and with no sign of reinforcements, Taylor rides back to meet with Jackson, who had just crossed the South Fork Bridge. Surveying the scene, Jackson resolves to continue the attack. He would march across the North Fork Bridge, burning or not, and drive the enemy into the ground. At that moment, Major Wheat is slowly escorting his Louisiana Tigers through the destroyed Federal camp and across the South Fork Bridge. Jackson determines to use Wheat's battalion to lead the attack and orders them to pass through the Marylanders and take the burning bridge. Major General Ewell's adjutant, Captain Campbell Brown, remembered, "I shall never forget the style in which Wheat's battalion passed us as we stood on the road. Wheat was riding full gallop, yelling at the top of his voice, his big sergeant major running at top speed just after him, calling upon the men to come on, and they strung out according to their speed and stomach for the fight, following after, all running, all yelling, all looking like fight. The peculiar zouave dress, light striped baggy pants, bronze and desperate faces, and wild excitement made up a glorious picture. Wheat himself looked in the fight as handsome as any man I ever saw." With Wheat in the lead, the Tigers descend the road towards the river's edge, storm across the bridge through the flames, and secure the other side in the face of the enemy's desperate fire. Wheat's battalion is soon joined by Brigadier General Taylor and the remainder of the Louisiana Brigade, who quickly put out the blaze. The span is saved, but it was rather a near thing. Taylor later recalled, "My horse and clothing was scorched, and many men burned their hands severely while throwing brands into the river." With the North Fork Bridge now in Confederate hands, Jackson orders Johnson's 1st Maryland and Taylor's Louisianians to push up the road and through the wooded gap to dislodge the Federals. In the meantime, Colonel Flournoy's 6th Virginia Cavalry Regiment attacks the Federals from the rear, unhinges their line, and forces them to retreat farther up the road towards Winchester. Jackson's aide-de-camp, 1st Lieutenant Henry Kidd Douglas, remembered, "The pursuit begun was kept up vigorously. There was much handsome work done by Flournoy's cavalry, with good results. By late afternoon, the mounted Virginians run down what is left of Kinley's doomed command near Cedarville, capturing the whole lot, including the regiment's colors and the colonel himself." While the cavalry in the 1st Maryland pursued Kinley, Wheat's Tigers are recuperating along the shady banks of the North Fork when they hear a train whistle coming from the direction of Manassas Gap. Earlier in the day, Flournoy's cavalry had cut the telegraph lines between Strasburg and Manassas, and the engineer of the Federal train, which consists of 2 locomotives, 3 passenger and 50 freight cars, apparently has no idea the town has been filibustered by Jackson's army. Sensing an opportunity for more glory for his men, Wheat quickly rouses his Tigers up from their late afternoon snooze and orders them to charge the moving train. Swarming up the embankment and across the flat land, the Tigers hop aboard the locomotive, throw its wholly surprised driver to the ground, and bring the train to a stop. When the former New Orleans wharf rats open the rail cars, they are pleasantly surprised to find more than $300,000 worth of commissary and quartermaster stores packed inside. All told, the Battle of Front Royal cost Major General Banks about 900 casualties, 750 prisoners, 32 killed, and 122 wounded, and Major General Stonewall Jackson loses only 36 men, mostly from Flournoy's 6th Virginia Cavalry. With Front Royal saved from the grasp of the Federals, Jackson is able to turn Banks from his position at Strasburg, hit him at Middletown on May 24th, and press on towards Winchester by the next morning. With the capture of Front Royal, the road to Winchester lay open, and with it, the chance of finally driving Banks' department of the Shenandoah out of the valley entirely. After Union Major General Nathaniel P. Banks' retreat north from Strasburg, Virginia on May 24, 1862, he raised his forces from the Department of the Shenandoah, consisting of perhaps no more than 5,000 men, south of Winchester. His line stretches for about 2.5 miles from Camp Hill on the southeast edge of the town to Bowers Hill, southwest of Winchester. The confidence his men have in him is reassuring, but Major General Banks still faces a difficult situation on the morning of May 25th. Not only is he greatly outnumbered, as Confederate Major General Stonewall Jackson can count on probably close to 16,000 soldiers, but the town of Winchester also lies directly in the Union rear, and so any retreat through the town streets would potentially be restricted. Next, his men are exhausted. For example, 2 regiments that had been part of the rear guard, the 2nd Massachusetts and 27th Indiana, had marched upwards of 30 miles on May 24th. Finally, because so many of his supply wagons have been captured or destroyed by the Confederates, Banks' men have little to nothing to eat. Jackson's army, which has been renamed the Department of the Valley, begins the opening actions of the Battle of Winchester at first daylight on May 25, 1862. Stonewall Jackson divides his command. He takes part of his force and advances along the paved Valley Turnpike, while Major General Richard S. Ewell guides his men on the Front Royal Road to strike the Union left atop Camp Hill. Brigadier General Isaac Trimble's brigade attacks the Union troops atop Camp Hill first, advancing through a heavy morning fog to be greeted by rifle fire from Colonel Dudley Donnelly's 1st Brigade of Brigadier General Alpheus S. Williams' 1st Division. Troops from Donnelly's brigade, comprised of the 5th Connecticut, 28th New York, and the 46th Pennsylvania, have a clear field of fire against Trimble's brigade as it advances up Camp Hill. Colonel Trimble's lead units, the 21st North Carolina and 21st Georgia Infantry Regiments, whom Trimble refers to in reports as my 221st, bear the brunt of the destructive Federal volley fire. Initially, the 28th New York and 46th Pennsylvania deliver a successive series of well-aimed rifle volleys into the attackers. But as the 221st get closer, the 5th Connecticut, directly in the path of the attackers, rises up from the ground before delivering a destructive volley. The Connecticut men then fix bayonets and surge down the hill and send Trimble's men fleeing. With the North Carolinians and Georgians driven from the field, Trimble is unable to offer support, as his brigade's other 2 regiments, the 15th Alabama and 16th Mississippi, are not prepared to attack. Shortly after Union troops drive Trimble's men from Camp Hill, Stonewall Jackson concludes that if his forces are to win the battle, they would have to strike the western end of the Union line, situated solidly atop Bowers Hill. Major General Jackson can see Federal troops moving right to the protection of a low stone wall, where they would be protected and able to fire into Jackson's left flank. Stonewall Jackson knows that Bowers Hill has to be taken if victory is to be secured. At the moment, Bowers Hill seems impenetrable, with nearly a dozen artillery pieces guarding the high ground while stone and wooden fences protect Colonel George H. Gordon's 3rd Brigade of Williams' Division. To crack the position, Jackson turns to his old command, the Stonewall Brigade, and orders them to take the ridge. Brigadier General Charles S. Winder's Stonewall Brigade, comprised of the 2nd, 4th, 5th, 27th, and 33rd Virginia Infantry Regiments, steps off towards Bowers Hill in nearly perfect alignment. The Stonewall Brigade's attack goes smoothly until the Confederates begin to climb the slopes. As the brigade ascends the hill, a hailstorm of lead and iron from Union artillery and infantry paralyzes the attackers on the slopes of Bowers Hill. Stonewall Jackson quickly determines to use a flank attack to break the Union position, a tactic that will soon become his trademark. To turn Major General Banks' right flank, Jackson chooses Brigadier General Richard Taylor's Louisiana Brigade. General Taylor marches his men westward along Abrams Creek to a point where it emerges in a hollow depression. There, he's joined by 2 regiments from Brigadier General William B. Taliaferro's brigade, currently commanded by Colonel Samuel V. Fulkerson, the 10th Virginia and 23rd Virginia. The Confederate force readies itself for the flank attack, all the while exposed to Union artillery and musket fire. As bullets and shells rain down, many Confederate soldiers try their best to avoid being struck. When Taylor notices some men dodging the fire, he yells profanities at them, condemning their behavior. Jackson, who's nearby, hears the cursing, glares in a disapproving manner, and tells Taylor that he is a wicked fellow. With artillery support, Taylor's men surge forward. The attack commences at approximately 7:30 a.m. and quickly gathers momentum. As Taylor's men bear down on the Union right flank, General Banks' cavalry strikes Taylor's left. However, Lieutenant Colonel Francis T. Nichols' 8th Louisiana Infantry Regiment repulses the Union horsemen. The Union soldiers fire, the Federal artillery belches canister, but the Louisianians simply fill in the gaps and stubbornly press on. Soon other Confederate soldiers join in the attack, forcing Banks' soldiers to take to their hills and flee for safety. While the rout of Union forces develops on Jackson's left, Ewell finally breaks the left end of the Union line on Camp Hill. By 8:30 a.m., Jackson has defeated Banks' army. As frightened Union soldiers retreat north through the streets of Winchester, some of the Confederate townspeople, according to Union accounts, take well-aimed shots at the fleeing soldiers. Joining the retreat are some of Winchester's Union sympathizers who do not want to be subjugated to a Confederate occupation. On the heels of the withdrawing Union troops are Jackson's men. As Confederate soldiers stream through the streets, many joyous townspeople come out to greet them. At times, the crowds of people cheering Jackson's command become so large that Confederate soldiers have to hold their fire to avoid injuring innocent bystanders. Although defeated, as Jackson later admits, Banks' force preserved their organization remarkably well. At one point, Major General Banks appeals to some of his men to rally and make a stand. "My God, men, don't you love your country?" he apparently asks. "Yes," one Yankee soldier replies, "and I'm trying to get to it as fast as I can." The commotion in Winchester also holds up Jackson's men. They come upon abandoned wagons from Banks' supply train. One Confederate officer later remembered, "We found delicacies of every description, sutler's stores crowded with everything we wanted, and we were unable to pursue the enemy on account of the fatigued condition of our men." The looting of the Federal supply wagons by the Confederates would earn Major General Banks a new derisive nickname by the rebels, Commissary Banks. Once the Confederate soldiers pushed through the throngs in Winchester's streets, they pursued Banks' force to Stevenson's Depot, north of the town. After reaching Stevenson's, the pursuit halts. With his infantry and artillery exhausted and an insufficient cavalry pursuit force, Jackson loses the opportunity to annihilate Banks. After the Battle of Winchester ends, Jackson's army sets up camp 5 miles north of the town. The remnants of Banks' force marches 22 miles north to Martinsburg. Although able to escape, Banks loses nearly 1/3 of his force, approximately 2,000 casualties. He also loses a tremendous amount of military stores with the loss of the supply wagons. Jackson's losses are considerably less, approximately 400 casualties. The casualties inflicted on Banks and the supplies captured are little consolation to Jackson, who had wanted to destroy Banks' army, but it is not meant to be. 3 days after the battle, Jackson receives orders from General Robert E. Lee to move to Harper's Ferry and give the impression that his army might march into Maryland or attack Washington, D.C. When Jackson's army departs, only one regiment, the 21st Virginia, remains to garrison Winchester and take care of Union prisoners of war. 3 days later, on May 31st, no Confederates occupy Winchester. On that day, Jackson withdraws south to prevent being captured in the lower Shenandoah Valley by 2 Union forces, Brigadier General James Shields advancing from the east and Major General John C. Fremont from the west. Even though Jackson is unable to decisively crush Banks at Winchester and has to abandon the town less than 1 week after taking it, Jackson's victory at the Battle of Winchester, which would be the first of 3 major battles fought in the town, greatly benefits the Confederates under General Joseph E. Johnston, who are defending Richmond from Major General George B. McClellan's push on the Confederate capital via the Virginia Peninsula. After the Battle of Winchester, President Lincoln and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton recalled Major General Irvin McDowell's forces from First Corps, which at the moment is beginning to move on Richmond via Fredericksburg to link up with McClellan. so that it can take position near Manassas to protect Washington. The Battle of Winchester achieves tactical as well as strategic objectives. Jackson's victory in the lower valley causes celebration among Confederate troops defending Richmond. 4 days later, after the Battle of Winchester, General Johnston issues General Orders No. 58, celebrating Jackson's victories at Front Royal in Winchester. Jackson's victories are splendid, but his work is not yet done. Two Federal armies, under Generals Fremont and Shields, still loom on the horizon. He would deal with these two forces at Cross Keys and Port Republic in early June, capping off his near mythical Shenandoah Valley campaign of 1862. After his victory at the Battle of Winchester on May 25, 1862, Major General Stonewall Jackson advances to the Potomac River at Harper's Ferry with his Department of the Valley, but then having to hurry south to avoid being cut off by two Union forces, narrowly escaping the converging Federal forces as he passes through Strasburg on June 1st. He then continues to march his army hard southward up the Shenandoah Valley. Major General John C. Fremont, commanding the Union's Mountain Department with 15,000 men, follows in pursuit along the North Fork of the Shenandoah River, west of Massanutten Mountain, while Brigadier General James Shields' division of Major General Urban McDowell's First Corps, now relabeled the Department of the Rappahannock, marches up the South Fork through the Luray Valley, east of the mountain. In an attempt to keep those forces from uniting, Jackson orders the burning of numerous bridges along both rivers. When he reaches the end of Massanutten, where the mountain would no longer separate the Union columns, he decides to make a stand before they could unite against him, using the strategy of defeat in detail against the divided Federal forces. On June 6, 1862, Colonel Turner Ashby, in command of the 7th Virginia Cavalry Regiment, is killed in a skirmish with Union troops of the 1st New Jersey Cavalry and the 13th Pennsylvania Reserves at Chestnut Ridge, a clash would become known as the Battle of Good's Farm, just outside of Harrisonburg. The loss of the famed Ashby, the Black Knight of the Confederacy, is deeply felt within the Confederate ranks. Captain Campbell Brown remembered that, later in the evening I saw a party of cavalry pass by with Ashby's body, crying, most of them like children. On the night of June 6-7th, Jackson's army bivouacs north of the town of Port Republic in Rockingham County. The village sits at the confluence of the South River and the North River, which join to form the South Fork of the Shenandoah River. Major General Richard S. Ewell's division encamps along the banks of Mill Creek near Good's Mill. The famed foot cavalry of Jackson's division under Brigadier General Charles S. Winder of the Stonewall Brigade set up their bivouacs on the northern bank of the North River, posted near the bridge. A single regiment, the 15th Alabama under Colonel James Canty, is left to block the roads at Union Church. Jackson sets up his army's headquarters at Madison Hall in Port Republic, while the army supply trains are parked nearby. The two Union columns begin to converge on Jackson's position around Port Republic. Major General Fremont's 15,000-strong mountain department moves south on the Valley Turnpike and reaches the vicinity of Harrisonburg on June 6, shortly after the cavalry skirmish at Good's Farm. Brigadier General Shields' division, containing about 10,000 men, advances south from Front Royal in the Luray Valley, but the Federal division is badly strung out on its march because of the muddy Luray Road. At Port Republic, Major General Jackson possesses the last intact bridge on the North River and the fords on the South River by which Generals Fremont and Shields can unite. Using excellently drawn topographic maps designed by his staff officer and cartographer Jedediah Hotchkiss, General Jackson determines to check Fremont's advance at Mill Creek, while meeting Shields on the east bank of the North Fork. A Confederate signal station on Massanutten Mountain monitors the Union's progress. Later in the day, on June 7th, Fremont's advance guard encounters Jackson's pickets near Cross Keys Tavern. A few shots are fired, and the Union cavalry falls back on their main body, which is fast approaching. Darkness prevents further developments in the skirmish at Cross Keys Tavern on the 7th. Brigadier General Shields sends ahead Colonel Samuel S. Carroll and his 4th Brigade of Infantry, together with the 1st West Virginia Cavalry and Battery H, 1st Ohio Light Artillery, to secure the North River Bridge at Port Republic. The pious Major General Jackson has looked forward to Sunday, June 8th as a quiet opportunity for divine worship. Confederate cavalry, however, is in a good bit of disarray in the wake of Ashby's death, failed to give timely warning that Federal cavalry is riding hard for Port Republic. Shortly after dawn on June 8, 1862, Colonel Carroll, at the head of the 1st West Virginia Cavalry, scatters the Confederate pickets, and at about 8:30 a.m., his troops splash across the South River before dashing into Port Republic, which is held by just 3 companies. The bulk of Jackson's army is camped across the North River. Stonewall, who had spent the night in town with his staff, has just a few moments' notice of the impending raid. While the Federals thunder through the streets rounding up prisoners, Major General Jackson and his staff race down the main street from headquarters and across the North River Bridge, narrowly eluding being taken as prisoners by the Yankees, although 2 members of his staff are captured by troopers of the 1st West Virginia Cavalry. The Federal cavalry raiders make for the Army supply wagons south of town, but run into an ambush orchestrated by a doughty company commander in the 2nd Virginia, Captain Samuel J.C. Moore. Jackson rallies his infantry across the river, and when Confederate troops swarm over the bridge, the Union horsemen flee the village in a good bit of confusion. For a chagrined Jackson, it has been an inauspicious morning. While Jackson solidifies his grip on Port Republic, the situation west of town presents potential disaster. At daybreak, Fremont has his army on the move from Harrisonburg and embark on a collision course with Ewell's division at Cross Keys, known by the grandized sobriquet Pathfinder for his legendary explorations of the Rocky Mountains in the west. Fremont has 7 brigades at his disposal, roughly 10,500 men, itching for a chance to bring the elusive rebels to bay. Only Major General Ewell, with 3 brigades and some 5,000 men, blocks the Federal advance on Jackson's rear. Notwithstanding his decided numerical advantage, Fremont faces tough opposition. Endowed with pop eyes and a dramatically receding hairline, Ewell has earned the unflattering sobriquet Old Baldhead from his waggish troops. But despite an eccentric appearance, Richard Stoddard Ewell is a thoroughgoing soldier. A West Point graduate and a respected Mexican War veteran, Ewell is regarded as a tough fighter who knew his business. Perhaps more importantly, he has chosen his ground well, deploying his troops on a formidable ridgeline a mile south of Cross Keys. The position is ready-made for an energetic defender. "A valley and rivulet in my front," reported a delighted Ewell, "woods on both flanks, and a field of some hundreds of acres where the road crossed the center of my line." Fremont, however, gives little serious thought to maneuver and orders his men into line of battle across the open ground in Ewell's front. Brigadier General Lewis Blanker's division occupies the Union left flank, while the attached brigades of Robert H. Milroy and Robert C. Schenck occupy the right. General Louis Blanker is a German revolutionary who has immigrated to America after the revolutions of 1848, a prominent German-American immigrant from New York. Blanker had led a brigade in the Battle of Bull Run in 1861, where he had held the rear guard of the Federal retreat. A stern disciplinarian, he is not popular with the rank and file, but his strict discipline instills a sense of confidence and fighting spirit in his men, who are mostly German-American volunteers. At about 10 a.m., the artillery opens up. For jittery troops on both sides, it is a deafening overture. From the stronghold atop the ridge, Confederate gunners play havoc with Fremont's crouching infantry and engage in spirited counter-battery fire with their Federal opponents. For nearly an hour, the big guns slug it out, shaking the valley with an incessant rumble. It was, thought Federal Colonel Albert Tracy, a positive roar. Brigadier General Julius Stahl's 1st Brigade of Blanker's division begins the Union attack on the far left of the Federal battle line. On the opposite side of the battlefield facing Stahl's 1st Brigade are the 1,300 Confederates of Trimble's brigade, arrayed in line of battle in front of a clover field, possessing a clear field of fire against the advancing Bluecoats. Leading the attack of Stahl's brigade against Trimble's regiments are the 500 men of the 8th New York, which is comprised mostly of German immigrants. As the 8th New York advances through the Cloverfield to their front in search of the rebel line ahead, their movement is watched closely by 3 regiments of Confederate soldiers lying prone behind a rail fence on a ridge crowned with timber to their south. As the Germans of the 8th New York cross the narrow ravine directly beneath the ridge, the Federal regiment disappears momentarily from view. Not only are the enlisted men of the Yankee regiment inexperienced and green, but so are their field officers. The officers have failed to throw forward a line of skirmishers and mistaken the handful of rebel skirmishers that fall back in front of them as a few isolated, retreating foe. When the Yankees crest the ridge in perfect alignment, approximately 1,300 rebels, nearly the entirety of Trimble's brigade, are concealed 50 yards away. The Confederates rise quickly to their feet to fire, and they unleash a devastating single volley. The tremendous crash of musketry fells scores of bluecoats in seconds. Even the rebels are shocked by the lopsided bloodshed. The dead and wounded Yankees are lying on the field as thick as black birds, wrote Sidney Richardson of the 21st Georgia. In moments, the shattered remnants of the 8th New York stream in confusion back across the ravine, having lost half their number. The rebels give chase, but there is no reason, since the unfortunate Yankee regiment is in full retreat. Brigadier General Trimble, far from resting on his laurels in the aftermath of the repulse of the 8th New York, is eager to hammer the disorganized Federals. He soon has his eye on Yankee artillery across the valley. The Unionist Virginia Battery Captain Frank Buell, designated as Battery C, West Virginia Light Artillery. Trimble orders a portion of the 15th Alabama to execute a wide swing around the Federal left and then fall on the enemy flank. Led by Lieutenant Colonel John Trutland, the Alabamians gamely charge the position with fixed bayonets, but run into unexpected resistance. In addition to Captain Buell's guns, the hill is held by elements of the 27th Pennsylvania and a crack battalion of riflemen from the 13th Pennsylvania Reserves, the Bucktails, led by Lieutenant Colonel Thomas L. Kane. The Pennsylvania troops and Buell's artillerymen stubbornly contest their ground with the 15th Alabama. After a bloody exchange of gunfire, Trutland is forced to pull his men back to regroup. The Pennsylvanians, however, are soon assailed by Trimble's other 2 regiments. The 16th Mississippi drives into the center of the hill and suffers heavily from enfilading musketry emanating from the 27th Pennsylvania. The Mississippians' commander, Colonel Carnot Posey, is badly wounded and carried to the rear. The stalemate is broken by the 21st Georgia under Colonel John T. Mercer. His regiment crashes into the Pennsylvanians and unhinges the Federal position. Union troops flee for the rear in some disorder, but have given a good accounting of themselves. Their bravery, thought Brigade Commander Brigadier General Robert Milroy, was evidenced by the number of dead rebels strewn on the hillside. Trimble's blood is clearly up, and he is eager to maintain his momentum by keeping up the pressure on the enemy. His next target is another Federal battle line stretched across 2 hillocks near the homestead of Farmer George Evers. The position is a stout one, occupied by the Federal 3rd Brigade of Brigadier General Henry Bolden, who commands 4 regiments of New York and Pennsylvania volunteers. Bolden's 3rd Brigade stands in support of 2 batteries of artillery. The 2nd Battery, New York Light Artillery led by Captain Louis Shermer, and Battery I, 1st New York Light Artillery under Captain Michael Weidrich. The Confederates would face a tough fight at the Evers farm. Trimble, personally leading half of the 15th Alabama, swings around to the right, and the rest of his brigade is regrouping from the previous attacks. He has help in the form of 2 other regiments from Elzey's brigade, Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Duffy's 25th Virginia and the 13th Virginia under the command of Colonel James Walker. Coming in on Trimble's right, the Virginians are subjected to a punishing fire. Musketry sweeps their ranks, and Weidrich's battery switches the canister rounds for their guns. Stalled but by no means willing to give up the fight, Colonel Walker takes up positions behind a rail fence, and the 13th Virginia trades fire with the Federals on the hill. With the Yankees thus occupied, Trimble readies his Alabamians for a final push that he is certain would smash Bolden. He's only partly correct. The Federal position is disintegrating largely due to an unfortunate disagreement in the officer corps. Although Weidrich's battery has driven back the enemy with heavy casualties, the artillerymen are abruptly ordered from the field by Captain Shermer. Bolin and Weidrich protest the move, but are overruled in a bizarre arrangement, which leaves Captain Schirmer, the senior artillery officer, on the field with the final word. As Weidrich pulls out his cannons, Federal infantry follows suit, and Trimble's final drive to secure the hill is somewhat uncontested. Fremont is quickly losing interest in the fight altogether. After Trimble has battered in his left for roughly a mile, the general opts to pull in that flank and press forward the rest of his line. His prosecution of the attack is half-hearted at best. Brigadier General Milroy, commanding in the center, is game enough for a fight, but has little support as he approaches a formidable enemy position on the ridge. Confederate artillery subject his men to a fearful barrage as they come forward, and Milroy attempts to gain a modicum of cover in a shallow ravine. It affords only momentary respite. As Milroy's troops approach a second ravine, recalled the general, we discovered it was full of rebels lying behind a fence in the tall grass almost wholly concealed from view. The results of the surprise are predictable. Milroy's lead troops are shot down, and the demoralized Federals, firing blindly at the enemy they cannot see, become hopelessly stalled. Milroy angles towards his right front, but fares no better in further attempts. He again runs into woods full of rebels. A deadly fire came out of it, wrote a dismayed Milroy, and my boys were dropped by it rapidly. The expected support to his right from Schenck's brigade is a virtual no-show that leaves Milroy's troops to bear the brunt of Confederate attention. Schenck leads a ponderous brigade of 5 Ohio regiments backed by 2 batteries, but the politician-turned-general has only the vaguest notion of how to use them. Colonel Albert Tracy of Fremont's staff disgustedly reports that while Milroy's brigade is being chewed up, Schenck makes a lukewarm approach on the Confederate right, which he merely brushed with emphasis. With that, the Federal offensive at Cross Keys, such as it was, fizzles out in anticlimax. Alarmed that his troops have faced a real fight from an enemy half their strength, Major General Fremont is content to pull back and assume the defensive. Major General Ewell characteristically moves forward and occupies the surrendered ground. In thinly veiled contempt for his opponent's tactical bumbling, Old Baldhead caustically observes that he felt all day as though he were again fighting the feebled, semi-civilized armies of Mexico. The battle of Cross Keys ends that afternoon with the retreat of Major General Fremont's mountain department from the field. Union forces in the Battle of Cross Keys have suffered a total of 684 casualties, with 114 men killed, 443 wounded, and 127 missing or captured. Total Confederate casualties for Ewell's division are 287 men lost, with 42 killed, 230 wounded, and 15 missing or captured. The retreat of Fremont's mountain department from Cross Keys signals a major victory for the Confederates, as it effectively eliminates his army as a threat on the board for Jackson's forces. Back in Port Republic, the encouraging news of the victory at the Battle of Cross Keys proves crucial, as Stonewall Jackson plans his next move. Following the embarrassing dust-up with Federal cavalry that morning, Jackson is eager to pounce on the exposed lead elements of Shields' column northeast of town. With a passive Fremont clearly on his heels at Cross Keys, Major General Jackson is now free to take advantage of the situation. Jackson decides to throw his full weight at Shields rather than Fremont, because Shields is nearly begging to be attacked. Jackson explains afterward, his force is smaller, badly straggling, and his line of retreat lay over poor roads. Most importantly, Shields' isolated vanguard, under the command of Brigadier General Erastus B. Tyler, is vitally positioned just 2 miles from Port Republic. This would be where Jackson would make his move. The attack he plans to carry out on Monday, June 9th, would result in the climactic final battle of Jackson's Valley campaign. Following the victory of Richard S. Ewell's division over John C. Fremont's Union Mountain Department in the Battle of Cross Keys on June 8th, Major General Stonewall Jackson wastes little time making his next move. His first order of business is concentrating his forces for the proposed attack on the Union Department of the Rappahannock Forces at Port Republic, which is comprised of brigades from Brigadier General James Shields' division, although Shields himself is not present in the coming battle. Stonewall is pleased with the outcome of the fight at Cross Keys, and eventually orders for a token holding force to contest the ground in front of Fremont while the bulk of Ewell's division slips away for the combined blow against Brigadier General Erastus B. Tyler's forces at Port Republic. The rearguard duty falls to Brigadier General Isaac Trimble, a static task which he is poorly suited. It is all that Jackson and Ewell can do to keep the impetuous brigadier from attacking the Yankees single-handed. Major General Jackson would have little rest that night. In addition to organizing the consolidation of his army, Jackson orders a last-minute fix to the very real obstacle of getting his infantry over the South River. An engineering outfit undertakes the construction of a makeshift bridge, but has little time for such a daunting task. The crew wrestles 6 wagons into the river and fills them with stones to serve as makeshift piers. The wagon beds are finally spanned by lumber hastily scrounged from a local sawmill, but the pioneers run short of planks. Although a few hours of back-breaking labor, the bridge is completed. The newly constructed bridge is serviceable, but far less sturdy than desired. Confederate troops, who have no idea what Stonewall has in store for them, are on the move before daybreak. At Cross Keys, the men of the 13th Virginia, who had not eaten all day on June 8th, begin cooking a belated meal at 3 a.m. They would be sorely disappointed again. "Boys, I am sorry for you," General Ewell announces, "but you have to put your utensils back as we have to march at once." Senior officers are equally in the dark. Brigadier General Charles S. Winders awaken at 3:45 a.m. with orders from General Jackson that clearly mean that a fight is in the offing. Brigadier General Winders to have his brigade in Port Republic within the hour. About sunrise on Monday, June 9th, 1862, the troops begin crossing the South River before turning north towards the Yankees. The river crossing, however, proves a fiasco from the outset. The results of moving thousands of armed men over a few rickety boards are predictable. While artillery batteries ford the river, infantry moving over the improvised footbridge find the crossing quickly degenerates to a precarious trapeze act. Due to the bottleneck at the river, Confederate troops would necessarily be thrown piecemeal into the fight. The unenviable task of launching the attack is assigned to Jackson's old outfit from Manassas, the legendary Stonewall Brigade. Jackson still regards the unit as one of his very best, and is ably led by Brigadier General Winder. Trained at West Point and blooded on the western frontier, Charles S. Winder combines unimpeachable personal bravery with rock-solid dependability. Alarmed by a superior's penchant for risk-taking and hard marching, Winder at one time referred to Jackson as insane. But in spite of the personality clash, the brigadier could be counted on to execute his orders with cool and deliberate judgment. At about 7 a.m., Winder makes contact with the enemy. The Battle of Port Republic, which would prove to be the last battle of Jackson's Valley campaign, had begun. A skirmish line drawn from Colonel James W. Allen's 2nd Virginia quickly brushes aside a thin screen of federal pickets. It becomes apparent, however, that stiffer resistance lies ahead. In front of the Confederates lay several miles of farmland that stretches along the Shenandoah River's South Fork. The ground is primarily worked by the Bower and Lewis families, who carved a comfortable living from the fertile bottomlands. Largely planted in wheat, the fields, laced by farm lanes and rail fences, afford little cover. Worst yet, topography affords a decided advantage to the Federals, and Brigadier General Tyler would enjoy a position of considerable strength. As Confederate troops come into view, he calmly holds his men under cover near the Lewis homestead. The Confederate advance, which would come across open ground, is hemmed in by the river on the left. More ominously, the Federal left flank rests on a prominent knob that commands the entire field. The Lewis family had leveled the site for a charcoal burning operation that supplied the needs of the farm, rendering the site an ideal artillery position. Erastus Tyler values the spot for its abrupt elevation, an imposing 90 feet above the valley floor, and has 6 guns situated there. The locale would soon be enshrined in the American military lexicon as the scene of some of the most savage fighting of the war, the Coaling. Stonewall Jackson immediately grasps that possession of the Colleen carries victory with it, and orders Winder to seize the hill. General Winder, however, has only 4 regiments of the Stonewall Brigade with which to work. The Brigadier General orders the 2nd and 4th Virginia to execute a wide flanking maneuver through the woods on the right from which they can assault the Colleen. Captain Joseph Carpenter's Allegheny Roughs battery is to support their advance. As Captain Carpenter moves forward to occupy the enemy, Winder deploys his remaining 2 regiments, the 5th Virginia on his left and the 27th Virginia on his right. The infantrymen are backed up by the stalwart gunners of the Rockbridge Artillery led by Captain William T. Pogue. Brigadier General Winder initially holds his outnumbered infantry in support. The bulk of the Rockbridge Artillery, 4 guns, are smoothbores that Winder realizes would be next to useless in any duel with Federal guns on the Colleen. Captain Pogue consequently deploys with just 2 10-pounder Parrott rifles, which go into battery line in a wheat field next to the Bower Farm Lane. They are soon joined by 2 pieces from Carpenter's battery, which have gotten nowhere in a failed attempt to work its way through the underbrush off the Confederate right. From the outset, the Confederate attempt to flank the Colleen is deteriorating. In the face of such uneven odds, rebel gunners work their pieces manfully, but take a heavy beating in the process. Federal gunners quickly acquire the range with their rifled pieces, and from their elevated perch they send shells plunging through the Confederate crews. For their part, the Union gunners remain largely unscathed, noting that the majority of incoming fire passes harmlessly overhead. Jackson is proud of his artillerists, but he notes that they are outmatched. The artillery fire was well sustained by our batteries, but found unequal to that of the enemy, he wrote. Winder works his men of the Stonewall Brigade towards the left in a desperate attempt to gain cover from the cannonade, and the 5th Virginia takes up posts adjacent to the Shenandoah River. Brigadier General Tyler finally unleashes his own infantry, when left in a broad arc that leaves his lane stretched across the valley floor along the loose farm lane. He comfortably anchors his right on the river, his left on the Colleen. It is, though, a somewhat disjointed arrangement. The 2-regiment Confederate thrust likewise causes Tyler to split his force, and a yawning gap opens in the center of the Yankee position. The Federal line was formed in 2 distinct and unconnected parts, wrote Captain James Huntington, who commanded Battery H, 1st Ohio Light Artillery. Still, the 3,000-strong Union force easily dwarfs Winder's 2 regiments, which brings fewer than 600 men into action. It is a horribly mismatched affair. Brigadier General Winder's men advance under fire and hold on as best they can, but as the valley floor erupts with sheets of musketry and gunpowder smoke, it likewise becomes apparent that Federal artillery fire from the right shows no signs of letting up. Much to Winder's dismay, the planned flank attack of the 2nd and 4th Virginia against the Colleen ends in an anticlimactic flop. The 2 regiments had reached a ravine in front of the hill, exchanged a few volleys with its defenders, and summarily fallen back. For Winder's beleaguered infantry, the full force of Tyler's line is simply more than they can bear, and the general pulls back to a safer distance. As Winder regroups along the Bower Lane, reinforcements arrive on the field. It is Brigadier General Richard Taylor's Louisiana Brigade, a hard-fighting outfit that is one of Jackson's best brigades. Although attached to Ewell's division, the Louisianans have missed the action at Cross Keys and are itching for a fight when they reach the front at the Battle of Port Republic. The Pelican Staters are a colorful lot. The 4-regiment brigade includes Wheat's Battalion, more famously known as the Louisiana Tigers, a motley set of New Orleans street toughs who are poorly disciplined but fierce brawlers. The unit is led by Major Chatham Robideau Wheat, a barrel-chested Army veteran, soldier of fortune, and no-nonsense combat officer who had led his battalion of New Orleans Wharf Rats on Matthews Hill during the Battle of Manassas. Another notable outfit in Taylor's Louisiana Brigade is the 6th Louisiana Infantry Regiment, led by Colonel Isaac G. Seymour. The 6th Louisiana ranks includes many Irish immigrants hailing from New Orleans' Irish Channel, as well as a smattering of German and Polish immigrants from the rural parts of Louisiana. Like Wheat's Battalion, the Irishmen, Germans, Poles, Cajuns, and native-born Pelican Staters of the 6th Louisiana are tough and hardy fighters who aren't afraid of getting thrown into difficult situations. For Jackson, the Louisiana Brigade's timely arrival on the field is nothing short of providential, and he immediately directs Brigadier General Taylor to send one of his regiments up in support of Winder and lead the bulk of his Louisiana Brigade to the vortex of the fighting. The Louisianans would assault the Colleen. Winder's men of the Stonewall Brigade are glad to have the help. Under the pressure of a federal counterthrust, the rebels are holding on as best they can at the Bower Lane, while Taylor takes time to move up the rest of his brigade in a wide flanking maneuver around the Colleen. Winder strengthens the center of his line with Colonel Harry T. Hayes' 7th Louisiana, which was detached by Taylor to support the Stonewall Brigade, and rushes forward a battery of horse artillery under the command of Captain Roger Preston Chew. As the guns of Chew's battery roll into action, they enter a maelstrom. Enemy fire sweeps the field, which recalled artillerist George Neese, was covered with limping, bleeding, and groaning men. Winder's hard-pressed troops are nearly frantic for assistance amid the storm. "Hurry up!" they shout to the gunners. "They're cutting us all to pieces!" With his lines stabilized, Brigadier General Winder faces a crucial decision. Even after strengthening his line, the position, subjected as it is to a terrible plunging fire from the enemy artillery, is a treacherous one. With the Louisiana Brigade on the move for the Colleen, Winder feels compelled to make the most of the unenviable of tactical judgments by launching his men directly into the Federals. The counterattack is a desperate attempt to distract the attention from Taylor's Louisianans, on whose fortunes the fate of battle obviously rests. The Confederates went forward gamely enough, recalled in admiring Winder, in gallant style with a cheer. Winder's 4-line counterattack is a grim sacrifice. The Confederates brave the firestorm and suffer horrendous casualties. Guns on the Colleen, thought 7th Louisiana Captain Daniel Wilson, poured streams of shell and shot, mowing down our men like grass. The earth seemed covered with the dead and wounded. Union musketry adds to the bloodshed, and the 3 assaulting regiments are badly mauled. Their Federal opponents fare a little better. The 7th Indiana on Tyler's right suffers especially heavy losses as it fights it out with the 5th Virginia. Colonel James Gavin stalks up and down his line of Hoosiers, bellowing orders and waving his sword overhead. The common soldier dies without such heroics. Despite taking a toll on their northern opponents, the rebels are forced to fall back, and Winder's Scratch Brigade rallies behind a rail fence. Sensing victory, Federal infantry lunge forward in a counterattack. As the Northerners sprint headlong across the wheat fields, the Confederates break for the rear. Backwoods hunters from the 7th Indiana work around the left flank of the 5th Virginia and unleash a galling enfilade fire. Colonel Gavin shouts simple orders to his Hoosiers: "Load, charge bayonets, and at 'em!" It is more than the outnumbered Confederates can bear. The enemy pressed his men so hard, reported Winder, that it was impossible to rally them. Just when all appears lost, Brigadier General Winder catches a glimpse of 2 Confederate regiments lying prone well to the front. It is Major General Ewell, fresh on the field after a hard march from Cross Keys and eager to strike a blow. He has arrived at the head of 2 regiments, the 44th and 58th Virginia, after swinging through the woods to the right and turning back towards the valley until he was facing the left rear of the charging Federals. He immediately knows what has to be done. Leading a headlong charge into the open, Ewell bursts into the Federal rear, delivers a concentrated rifle volley at close range, and stalls the Federal advance. But Ewell's Virginians, who have exposed their own flank by moving forward, pay a dreadful toll for their effort. Federal guns on the Colleen send shells crashing through the ranks, and the rebels fall back to the cover of the woods. Despite a continued trickle of Confederate reinforcements, morale flags after Winder has been so roughly handled. Only the capture of the Federal artillery batteries on the Colleen could save Jackson from a crushing defeat. Right on cue, Taylor's Louisiana Brigade arrives at the ravine in front of the Colleen just as troops in the valley are on the verge of collapse. The Louisianans are considerably winded after thrashing through tangled underbrush on their circuitous march towards the Federal right and find that they have missed their mark. Far from coming in on the Colleen's flank, they are facing the muzzles of enemy artillery head-on. Taylor immediately orders his entire brigade, approximately 1,700 strong, to the attack. "Forward! Charge the battery and take it!" he shouts at the top of his lungs. The 6th Louisiana holds the left of Taylor's battle line, with Wheat's battalion and the 9th Louisiana form in the center and the 8th Louisiana on the right flank. In an instant, the Tigers of the Louisiana Brigade rush into the ravine and claw their way up the other side, yelling, thought Neese, like mad demons. Startled Federal gunners on the hill frantically redirect their aim into the ravine and let loose with canister. The Louisianians take a fearful beating, but could not be stopped. Without pausing to regroup, bayonet-wielding Confederates rush into the battery, thrusting, clubbing, and cursing with wild abandon. Union artillerists defend their guns with admirable tenacity, but are overwhelmed in hellish hand-to-hand fighting. Apprehensive that a Federal counterattack could withdraw the 6 captured guns, Confederate troops begin slaughtering the battery horses. Such fears are not misplaced. Tyler is able to hastily scrap together 3 Ohio regiments, the 5th, 7th, and 66th, who are thrown at the Colleen. The Buckeyes come on, recalled Brigadier General Taylor, in a determined and well-conducted advance, and then pitch into the rebels in a brutal close-quarters bayonet fight. Considerably disorganized after their chaotic charge, Taylor's Louisianians fall back in front of the Union wave. Horrendous seesaw fighting ensues. Confederates fire on the position while they regroup and then once again scramble back up the hill into the midst of its Yankee defenders. The 6th Louisiana and Wheat's Battalion, holding the left flank of Taylor's battle line and as such are closest to the Federal batteries, take heavy losses in the ferocious fighting around the Colleen. The Federals fall back, rally, and charge again, seizing the summit amid nightmarish fighting that participants would never forget. Men beat each other's brains out, recalled an anonymous Louisianan. Those who go down to die think of only revenge, and they clutch the nearest foe with a grasp which renders death stronger. Once again, Major General Ewell shows impeccable timing. Coming up at the head of desperately needed reinforcements, the general throws his weight into the fight. In the midst of savage yelling and shrieks of the infamous rebel yell in the hazy fog of thick gunpowder smoke, the Confederates rally for a final attempt to capture the Colleen. Swarming up the hill and into the battery, rebel troops at last shatter Union resistance in an impetuous and bloody attack. Federal troops flee the position and succeed in drawing off just 1 gun. The scene of the bitter struggle resembles a charnel house. The hillside is littered with dead Confederates, and the summit is heaped with the dead and wounded of both sides, strewn about the guns. In moments, the fortunes of the battle have shifted irrevocably. With the fall of the Colleen, the Federal battle line down in the valley begins to rapidly unravel. Tyler issues orders for a general withdrawal, and although some of his troops put up a running fight, the retreat eventually degenerates into a chaotic rout. Sensing that a total victory is within grasp, Stonewall Jackson rides to the front and orders his entire line forward. The rebels threw the rear of our column in great disorder, recalled Union 4th Brigade Commander Colonel Samuel Carroll. It is a miraculous and sudden turn of events. Confederate troops who had been taking a grim beating all day rushed forward on the heels of the retreating Federals, and Jackson hurriedly sends up reinforcements that are arriving on the field. With the Yankees on the run, an exuberant Jackson is clearly in his element. "He who cannot see the hand of God in this is blind, sir, blind," Jackson said to Ewell. For Brigadier General Tyler and his Union forces, it is an utter disaster. Confederates pursue his demoralized troops for miles, snatching up stragglers by the dozen. After the battle has ended in catastrophe and his presence on the scene is nearly pointless, Major General John C. Fremont at last stumbles his way onto the hills overlooking the battlefield. His approach has been quite leisurely. Rather than threatening Jackson's rear, the Pathfinder had simply inched his way forward. By the time he arrives at Port Republic, Fremont is, naturally, stranded on the north side of the river. Confederate troops, who had ample time to get out of his way, had burned the North River Bridge. The Pathfinder then makes one of the most arguably pathetically impotent gestures of the war. Unlimbering his artillery on the heights overlooking the river, Fremont commences shelling the battlefield, where ambulance crews, as well as wounded of both sides, desperately scramble for cover. For his part, Stonewall Jackson has no further desire to meddle with either Fremont or Shields, both of whom have been largely emasculated during the fighting of the previous 2 days. The Battle of Port Republic ends in the late afternoon of June 9th. The battle has incurred 1,002 Union casualties and 816 Confederate losses. By the following morning, Jackson's troops have drawn off and are safely tucked away in the upper reaches of Brown's Gap in the Blue Ridge Mountains. After their lackluster performances, both Federal commanders receive orders to fall back. Major General Irving McDowell explains that Shields' troops are needed for the campaign against Richmond, and it is not considered expedient to continue the chase. Exactly whom had been chasing who during the 1862 Valley Campaign is likely an inscrutable mystery to the Lincoln administration. Jackson's stunning twin victories at Cross Keys and Port Republic on June 8th and 9th, 1862 comes at a heavy price. The ghastly human wreckage that litters the battlefield belays any pretenses to martial glory. Confederate losses for the 2 days amount to roughly 1,200 overall, including 239 killed. Federal forces have suffered even greater losses, 272 killed and 1,600 wounded and missing. Even the unflappable Stonewall Jackson is shocked by the carnage. "I never saw so many dead in such a small space in all my life," he wrote. The Confederates' victory at the Battle of Port Republic marked the effective conclusion of Stonewall Jackson's 1862 Shenandoah Valley campaign. With the success of his Valley campaign, Stonewall Jackson would become the most famous and celebrated soldier in the Confederacy, with his military feats reaching and impressing numerous military circles abroad in Europe. Jackson's victories in this campaign greatly bolsters the sagging morale of the Confederacy, with his successes seemingly being the only good news the Southern press could cover from the front lines over the past few months. In a classic military campaign of surprise and maneuver, Stonewall Jackson had pressed his army to travel 646 miles in 48 days of marching, and had won 5 significant battlefield victories with a Confederate force of about 17,000 against a combined Union force of over 50,000. Jackson had accomplished his difficult mission that had been given to him back in November of 1861, causing Washington to withhold over 40,000 troops from McClellan's offensive on the Virginia Peninsula. Finally, Stonewall Jackson's brilliant strategies and tactics of maneuvering his smaller army and quickly striking out against larger Union armies and defeating them in detail will become extensively studied by both historians and military organizations and academies across the United States and abroad, making Jackson's Valley Campaign a textbook example for military history of how to successfully wage a campaign of rapid movement and defeating larger armies in detail. The strategic magnitude of the Federal repulses at Cross Keys and Port Republic would become readily apparent in the coming weeks. Stonewall Jackson, having thrashed every Federal command in the Shenandoah Valley, is now at liberty to transport his troops to Richmond, with General Robert E. Lee swelling the ranks of his reorganized army in Northern Virginia in preparation for a major counteroffensive campaign against George B. McClellan's Army of the Potomac that would culminate in late June of 1862 in a series of engagements that would become known as the 7 Days Battles.